Hold it up to your ear. The old watch in the dresser drawer. The one with the cracked strap that stopped years ago and nobody ever took in. Hold it against your ear the way you did when you were small and somebody let you listen to theirs. If it ticks, somebody wound it. And if it does not tick, that tells you almost nothing about what it is worth. A dead watch and a worthless watch are two different things, and the people who buy these for a living are counting on you not knowing the difference. Let me tell you about a man named William Pogue. In September of 1972, Colonel Pogue put a Seiko chronograph on layaway at the exchange at Ellington Air Force Base in Texas. $64, paid in installments, because NASA had not yet issued him his official watch and he needed something to time engine burns. He carried that $64 Seiko onto Skylab 4. He launched on the 16th of November, 1973, and came home 84 days later. He wore the government's Omega on his right wrist and his own layaway Seiko on his left. And nobody in the watch world knew for over 30 years. Not until 2006, when a collector went through NASA's mission photographs and caught a flash of yellow dial in the Skylab module. When that watch was auctioned in 2008 to benefit the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, the original layaway receipt was still in the box. $64, on-time payments, from a man who could not pay for it all at once. That is the whole thesis of this video, and I did not invent one word of it. So tonight, 15 ordinary old watches that can be quietly worth serious money. And I will be honest, the whole way down. Most old watches in most American drawers are worth between nothing and $40. I have watched too many good women drive to a jewelry counter full of hope and drive home feeling foolish. I will not be the reason that happens to you. One warning first, and it matters more than anything else I will say. Do not clean it. Do not have the case polished, the dial refinished, or the scratched crystal swapped for a bright new one. On old watches, honest age is the product. A dial that has warmed to the colour of weak tea over 60 years is exactly what collectors chase, and the moment somebody makes it look new, the money walks out and never comes back. And here is what nobody in this business has reason to say out loud. A service department makes money polishing cases and fitting fresh dials. That is billable. Telling you to leave it dirty is not billable to anybody, anywhere, ever, so it does not get said. Number 15. The Timex nobody thought twice about. I am starting here on purpose, so you will trust me for the next 14. Most Timex watches are worth $20 to $40, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. Timex built an empire on being disposable, and Americans believed it and threw them away by the millions. But the exceptions are specific. In 1933, the Ingersoll Waterbury Company of Connecticut licensed a certain famous mouse for a wristwatch and sold them at the Chicago World's Fair, and that little watch is widely credited with helping pull the company back from the edge during the Depression. Early ones in the original box have reportedly brought 4 figures. And here is the tell that surprises people. On a character watch, the box is frequently worth more than the watch. Children threw the box away in 1934. That is precisely why a surviving one is scarce. So, at home, wind it, then look for the box. Always look for the box. Number 14. Your mother's cocktail watch. The one that got weighed instead of read. You know the watch. Small, gold. A face half the size of a dime with little diamond chips beside it, on a woven bracelet or a black silk cord. Worn to church, to weddings, to her sister's funeral. It has not run since 1988, and somebody has already said the word scrap. Please do not let them. Here is what happens in the shop. A buyer sets it on a scale, reads a number in grams, offers a fraction of it, and is finished in 90 seconds. And understand why, because it is not simple dishonesty. Weight is the only number a man can calculate in 90 seconds. Identifying a 1948 retro case with a signed Swiss movement takes half a day and 3 reference books. The scale wins because the scale is fast. So before it touches a scale, read 3 things. The carat mark, the casemaker's mark, often a separate little symbol, and, if a watchmaker will open it for a few dollars, the name on the movement. Because the dial may say a department store, while the movement inside says Longines, or Jaeger-LeCoultre, or Movado, or Hamilton. A gold case with a signed Swiss movement is not scrap, it is a watch. Number 13. The Bulova Accutron, the watch that hums. This is the easiest test in the whole video, and you can run it right now. Find any old Bulova with a slightly odd, spaceship-looking face and hold it to your ear. If it ticks, it is a normal watch. But if it makes a faint, high, steady hum, like a mosquito shut in a jar, stop what you are doing. That is an Accutron. Bulova introduced it in 1960 with no balance wheel at all. It runs on a tiny tuning fork vibrating hundreds of times a second, developed by an engineer named Max Hetzel. It was the most accurate wristwatch on Earth, and Accutron tuning fork technology went into instrumentation used by the American space program. Public record, not legend. And nobody can put a hum in a gift box and sell it to you fresh every Christmas. Which is why the easiest test in vintage watches is the one no store has reason to teach. The one to look for is the space view. Bulova originally built it with no dial at all, so jewelers could set it in the window and let customers stare at the vibrating fork. It was never meant to be sold, but people kept asking to buy the display until Bulova put it into production. Which creates the trap, because it is very easy to pull the dial off an ordinary Accutron and call it a space view. A genuine factory space view generally carries its markings printed on the crystal itself. If a seller cannot show you those, walk on. Number 12. The Hamilton Electric, and a shape you have absolutely seen before. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1957. Hamilton released the first battery-powered wristwatch in the world and asked an industrial designer named Richard Arbib to make it look like the future had landed. He gave them a case shaped like a shield, all asymmetric angles. They called it the Ventura. Elvis Presley wore one in Blue Hawaii in 1961, which is why you recognize the shape even if you never once thought about it. There were sisters to it. The Van Horn. The Pacer. Now the honest part. The Hamilton Electric movements were troublesome. The early 500 caliber gave owners fits, and thousands went back to jewelers who solved it the practical way. They gutted them and dropped a quartz movement inside. So the case shape alone tells you nothing. A Ventura case with a quartz conversion is a pretty thing worth modest money. The same case with its original electric movement, running or not, is a different animal, so do not throw out the one that will not run. Here, a non-running original beats a working conversion every single time, and people make that mistake believing they are being sensible. Number 11. The Gruen Curvex, and a word that has been badly abused. Gruen was founded by Dietrich Gruen in 1894 and settled in Cincinnati, Ohio, for 60 years. Everybody calls Gruen an American company, and that is half the story. Gruen built its movements at a plant in Biel, Switzerland, and did the rest in Ohio. American name? Swiss Heart. In 1935, they managed something nobody had, a movement that was genuinely curved, so a rectangular watch could bend around the wrist instead of sitting on top of it like a domino. They called it the Curvex, and every watchmaker in the world tried to copy it. Now the correction, and it will save somebody real money. The word Curvex gets slapped on any old curved watch by sellers who do not know better, or who do. But there are only 4 true Curvex movements. Caliber 311 from 1935, 330 from 37, 440 from 1940, and 370 from 48. A man's watch without one of those 4 inside is not a Curvex, whatever the dial says and whatever the seller claims. Look also for the duo dial models, sometimes called doctor's watches, with a small seconds dial below the main one so a physician could count a pulse. And do not refinish the dial. A Gruen dial aged into copper and cream is the whole reason a collector wants it. Number 10. Wittnauer, and the woman nobody ever told you about. You will read everywhere that Wittnauer was a subsidiary of Longines and that Wittnauer watches carry Longines movements. That is not what the record shows. The 2 firms shared an American distribution company for over a century, which is why you see dials signed Longines Wittnauer. But testimony from United States Senate antitrust hearings in 1966 describes them as 2 separate companies, and the brands kept entirely separate product lines. Wittnauer sourced movements elsewhere, notably from Revue Toman. So when somebody sells you a Wittnauer by whispering that there is a Longines inside, that person has either not done the reading or is counting on the fact that you have not. Here is what they should tell you instead. Albert Wittnauer came to New York from Switzerland at 16 and built the company, and his brothers joined him. Then they died, one after another, until by 1916 there were no Wittnauer brothers left. So their sister took over, Martha Wittnauer. 55 years old, never formally run anything in her life, and in 1916 she became, as far as the record shows, the first woman to head a watch company. She ran it about 20 years. Through a world war, through the 20s, through the Depression. Under her, the company supplied precision instruments to aviators and explorers, and in 1932, when Amelia Earhart flew alone across the Atlantic in her Lockheed Vega, Wittnauer instruments were aboard that aircraft. She was also the first woman elected to the Horological Society of America. Martha is not in the sales pitch, because nobody makes a commission on her. Number 9. The Seiko chronograph, and the 8 digits that are the watch's real name. Colonel Pogue's watch was a Seiko 6139, on the market from 1969, one of the first self-winding chronographs anybody could walk in and buy. Bright dials, a rotating inner bezel, day and date. Cheap, cheerful, sold to working men by the crate. After those Skylab photographs surfaced in 2006, prices climbed sharply and have never really come back down. And collectors still argue over which exact model he owned, because the layaway receipt recorded the price and not the model. Which brings us to the skill. Flip any old Seiko over. You will find an 8-digit code, 4 digits, A-4 digits. That is the watch's actual name, not the word on the front, that code. Near it is a 6-digit serial, and this part is lovely. On most vintage Seikos, the first digit is the last digit of the year, and the second character is the month, with the letters O, N, and D standing in for October, November, and December. So a serial beginning 19 means a case made in September of a year ending in 1. You have just dated a watch at your kitchen table. Free, no tools, 11 seconds. Number 8. The Vulcain Cricket, the watch that chirps at you. Most people who own one have no idea it does anything unusual. In 1947, a Swiss firm called Vulcain solved a problem that had beaten watchmakers for decades. How do you fit an alarm loud enough to wake a man into something the size of $50? Their answer was a double case back, acting as a resonating chamber. It does not ring, it chirps, harsh and insistent, like a cricket in the wall. And in 1953, the White House News Photographers Association presented one to President Harry Truman. Presidents kept receiving them, and it picked up a nickname it still carries. The Watch of Presidents. Here is tonight's check. Look at the side of the case. If there are 2 crowns instead of 1, you have an alarm watch. The upper usually winds and sets the alarm, the lower runs the watch. Wind the alarm barrel, set the inner disc, and listen. Every so often, a family discovers that grandfather's plain dress watch has been carrying a voice for 60 years and nobody ever heard it. Let me pause, because we are halfway down. If this is useful, subscribe. That is the whole ask. I would rather you had this before somebody knocks on your door with cash in an envelope. And now the honest business, plainly. I am not a certified appraiser, and nothing here is a professional appraisal, an insurance valuation, or legal advice. Every price I mention is a reported figure from public sales, not a promise about your watch. Condition, originality, and paperwork change everything. Before you buy, sell, or insure anything you believe has real value, please check with a certified appraiser and with your state and local regulations. Ask the fee up front, and ask whether they also buy, because a person who appraises and buys is standing on both sides of your table. Number 7. The issued military watch, and the marks you must not remove. A soldier's watch was never meant to be pretty, only legible in bad light and hard to kill. So it looks like the plainest thing in the box. And on the back are scratched-looking marks the family has always assumed were damage. They are not damage. They are the watch's birth certificate. The most famous group collectors' chase is nicknamed the Dirty Dozen. At the close of the Second World War, the British Ministry of Defence issued a specification, and 12 Swiss firms filled it. Buren, Sima, Eterna, Grana, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Lemania, Longines, IWC, Omega, Record, Timor, and Vertex. One correction to how this usually gets told. These were largely delivered in 1945, at the very end of the fighting and in many cases after it, not throughout the war. Grana made by far the fewest, which is why a Grana makes a specialist sit up straight. America has its own, likelier to be in your house. The A11, made during the war by Elgin, Waltham and Bulova, was worn by so many Jais that people call it the watch that won the war. Later came Benrus and Hamilton field watches to military specification. So hear me. Do not polish that case back. I have watched a family send a father's service watch out to be made presentable before selling, out of respect for him, and get it back with the issue numbers buffed smooth. Everything that made it his was gone. And one real safety note. Many dials made before, roughly the 1960s, used radium in the luminous paint. General guidance from horological and radiation safety sources is that an intact, closed watch presents very low risk in normal handling. The caution is loose, flaking loom dust. So do not sand it, do not scrape it, do not pop the case open at the kitchen table, and do not let a child play with an open one. Let a professional watchmaker handle the inside, and take any concern about exposure to a qualified professional, not to a video. Number 6. The Universal Geneve Polerouter, designed by a 23-year-old. 1954. Scandinavian Airlines was about to begin flying the polar route over the top of the world, Copenhagen to Los Angeles. Nobody had done it commercially, and the magnetic conditions up there were brutal on instruments. Universal Geneve built a watch for those flights. Anti-magnetic, dish dial, long crab claw lugs. And the designer they handed it to was a young man named Gerald Genter, aged 23. That name may mean nothing to you, and everything to a collector. Genter went on to design the most influential sports watches of the century, and for decades the Polerouter sat almost unnoticed, priced like any other pleasant old Swiss watch. Two things to check. The very first examples were spelt Polerouter, with an A, before the name settled into Polerouter with an E, and those early ones are the scarce ones. And the better versions carry a microter movement, with the winding weight tucked inside the movement rather than sitting on top, which is why the watch is so slim. Designer attribution is the most undertaught value driver in this field, and you can see why. Nobody can trademark the sentence Gerald Genter drew this one. There is nothing in it to reorder in the spring. Number 5. The Muster Cartier tank. The one the snobs got wrong for 40 years. The Cartier tank goes back to 1917 and Louis Cartier. Andy Warhol owned tanks and said the thing collectors still, quote, that he did not wear it to tell the time, he wore it because it was the watch to wear. When his collection was sold at Sotheby's in 1988, the watches went with it. But the tank in your drawer is probably not a gold one. It is probably a must. In the early 1970s, Cartier launched the Muster Cartier line for people who could not spend a fortune. The cases were vermeil, solid sterling silver under a heavy layer of gold. And for 40 years, the fashionable opinion was that a must was not a real Cartier. That opinion was wrong, and wrong in a way that cost ordinary owners real money, because people sold on the strength of it. Vermeil is not gold plate over base metal. It is real gold over real silver, and the caseback is usually hallmarked accordingly. 2 checks. The caseback should carry Cartier markings and a serial number, properly engraved, not stamped shallow and crooked. And look very closely at the Roman numerals on the dial, usually the 7 o'clock numeral. Genuine Cartier dials hide the letters of the word Cartier inside one of the numerals, printed microscopically. It is called the secret signature. Get a good loupe and a bright lamp and go hunting. Number 4. The Breitling Navitimer, and the dial with no Breitling on it. The Navitimer is one of the most important pilot's watches ever made. That busy ring around the outside is not decoration, it is a circular slide rule, and pilots used it to work fuel burn, ground speed, and conversions in the air. And here is the detail almost every video on this subject leaves out, and it is the most valuable thing you could know about it. Breitling developed the Navitimer in cooperation with the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association in the United States, AOPA. The earliest examples were sold through the association, with the AOPA winged emblem on the dial. On some of those early dials, the name Breitling does not appear at all, which means if you inherit a Navitimer and the dial says AOPA where you expected Breitling, your first instinct will be that it is a fake, and you may be holding an early, more desirable example than the one with the brand name on it. Please do not throw away a watch because the wrong name is on the front. The classic reference is 806. Chronographs are exactly where parts get swapped and dials get married to the wrong cases, so originality is everything, and nobody ever made $1 teaching a widow to read a slide rule. Number 3. The Omega Speedmaster, that is not the moon watch. Everybody knows the Speedmaster went to the moon. That is not the useful part. The useful part is that Omega made a great many Speedmasters that never went near it, and those are the ones sitting unrecognized in American houses. Look for the Mark series from the late 60s and 70s. the Mark II, with its barrel-shaped case, the Mark 4.5, the Mark V. Big, sporty, slightly odd chronographs, never as glamorous as the professional model, and therefore worn hard and left in drawers. And here is the practical tool the other videos never mention. Omega maintains its own historical archive, and for a fee they will issue what is called an extract from the archives for a serial number. It tells you when that watch was produced and which country it was originally delivered to. A real service, from the manufacturer, available to an ordinary person. Now the warning that belongs with it. This is the watch most likely to disappear into a lot. Somebody comes to clear an estate, looks at a box of 9 old watches, and offers one round number. The family is tired, and the number sounds fair against 9 watches, and the entire value of that box was sitting in one of them. So never sell watches by the box. Photograph each one front and back, write down every code, research each separately, and research only what watches actually sold for, never what sellers are asking. Anybody can ask any number. Asking prices are fiction. Number 2. The American Railroad Pocket Watch, and a bit of history that started with a train wreck. On the 9th of April, 1891, 2 trains collided at Kipton, Ohio, and people died. In the investigation, an engineer's watch was found to have stopped for a few minutes and then started again on its own. A few minutes. A Cleveland jeweler named Webb C. Ball was brought in, and what came out of it changed American timekeeping. Railroad watch standards. Rules for how a railroad watch had to be built and how often it had to be checked, with inspectors to enforce them. Here is the checklist, and every item is something you can verify at the kitchen table in good light. Open face, no hinged lid over the dial. A white dial with bold black Arabic numerals, never Roman. Lever set, meaning you unscrew the bezel and pull out a tiny lever to move the hands rather than simply pulling the crown. And a jewel count of 17 or more, printed right on the movement, with the best grades at 19, 21 or 23. The names are Hamilton, especially the 992B, the Illinois Bun Special, the Elgin B.W. Raymond, the Waltham Vanguard, and anything marked Ball Official Railroad Standard. Now a correction. People will tell you a watch whose case does not match its movement is a cobbled-together fake. In American watchmaking, that is backwards. Movements and cases were sold separately. You chose your movement, then your case, from a different company entirely, and the jeweler fitted them together at the counter. A mismatched case is not fraud. It is how these were sold. The money is in the movement, not the case, and the back usually unscrews or pops open by hand. One legal note. Some old watch chains, fobs, and cases contain tortoiseshell or ivory. Federal and state laws restrict the sale of those materials, and the rules have been changing. Check current regulations before you sell anything of that kind. And for the ladies watching, look at your necklaces. A great many of these were converted into pendants when wristwatches took over, and the movement inside is still exactly what it always was. Number 1. The small Rolex. The one your mother wore to church. I put this at number 1 for a reason that has nothing to do with glamour. Of every watch I have named tonight, this is the one most likely to be sitting in an ordinary American woman's drawer right now, and the one most often sold for a fraction of what it is. I do not mean a diver's watch, I mean the quiet ones. The 34mm Oyster Perpetual, references like 1002 and 1003. The Oyster Date Precision, reference 6694. And above all the ladies' models, the little 26mm Oyster Perpetuals and the Lady Date Just, sold in enormous numbers to American women through the 60s, 70s and 80s as anniversary and retirement gifts. And for a quarter of a century, the trade told those women their watches were nearly worthless because they were too small. That was never a judgment about the watch. It was a judgment about a passing fashion for enormous cases, repeated so confidently that a generation of women believed it and sold accordingly. Small watches have been recovering strongly, and I think the people who spent 20 years calling them unsellable owe somebody an apology. Now the honest cautions, because this is also the most counterfeited name on earth. First, refinished dials are everywhere. A 60-year-old dial that looks factory fresh should raise your eyebrows, not your hopes. Under magnification, original printing is crisp and slightly raised. A redial looks flat, and the letter spacing goes subtly wrong. Second, and this one hurts, For many years, when a watch went in for official service, the policy was to replace tired dials and hands and dispose of the originals, which means a watch that comes back beautifully serviced can come back worth considerably less than it went in. That was a service philosophy of its era, not a scandal, but own that fact before you send anything anywhere. Third, the reference and serial numbers on older Rolexes are engraved between the lugs, underneath the bracelet. Do not pry a bracelet off yourself. Ask a watchmaker to look and to write the numbers down for you. And keep everything. The little tag, the papers, the booklet, the original bracelet, even if it's stretched and you replaced it with leather 30 years ago. In a market crawling with fakes and swapped parts, paperwork is not sentiment, it is evidence. And evidence is exactly what removes risk for a serious buyer. Removing risk is what they pay a premium for. So, 15 watches, and one habit that matters more than all of them. Leave it alone. Do not polish, refinish, buff or brighten. Turn it over and read what is there, because the name on the front is only the beginning and the truth is always on the back. Keep every scrap that came with it. Never sell as a lot. And take anything you believe is real to a specialist in vintage watches, not to whoever happens to have a shop on the corner, because a general buyer pays a general price. And please, before you buy, sell, or insure anything, check with a certified appraiser and with your own state and local regulations. Nothing in this video is a substitute for that. Now go get the old watch out of the drawer. Read me the name on the dial, just the name, in the comments, and the code on the back if there is one. I read them, and I will tell you honestly whether it is one worth looking up or one worth simply enjoying, because both are perfectly good answers. And here is the question I actually want to argue about. I said tonight that this market spent 25 years telling women their small watches were worthless and that it was wrong. Some of you carried a watch to a counter, were told it would not sell, and believed it. I want to know what you were told, and by whom, and what you did about it. And if you think I am wrong, say so, because I would rather be corrected than comfortable. The watch in that drawer stopped a long time ago, but it kept perfect time for somebody, on ordinary mornings, for years and years. And it has been waiting patiently in the dark ever since for someone to finally turn it over and read what is written on the back. Go and read it. Good night.